Well, good afternoon. I think some people are still logging into the Zoom meeting, and I want to say thank you for everybody that's here and joining today to look at this question for a little bit about charter schools, what they are, and as you can see from the title slide, why do we have charter schools? So thanks for joining, everybody. I hope this proves to be a good use of your time in the next half hour. Maybe learn a little bit more about the nature of the school that you're involved with Endeavor Charter School. So a little bit about me. My name is Michael Cox, and I'm the Executive Director of Western Sierra Charter Schools. And I'm going to provide a little bit of a biography here, just so sort of for the record here about who I am and what my professional credentials are to do the job. I have a bachelor's degree in history and social science, have a master's degree in education administration. I have 3 different teaching credentials. I have a multi-subject teaching credential. I have a single subject history, social science teaching credential, and I have also an administrative services credential. I've been working in public schools for over 30 years now. And for 21 years, I've been a part of leading charter schools. And it's been definitely the highlight of my professional work, has been working with these schools, this particular school at Endeavor that you're involved with. In 2002, I founded Glacier High School. In 2008, founded Western Sierra Charter Schools as a nonprofit corporation. And then a couple years ago, was a part of a team founding Endeavor Charter School. But more importantly than all of that, really, the truth is the home life is, for me, the absolute rock core of who I am and what really matters in life. And I undoubtedly share that with you folks as well. I've been married to my wife, Martine, for 30 years. She is the love of my life. I have 8 children, and all of our children have been schooled in our home through the years. My wife and I, early on, even as we were dating, were discussing geeky things like how to do school and stuff. And so we knew we wanted to homeschool from the beginning. So we've done that all the way through. Been at it. My dear wife has been at it for over 21 years and has probably about 9 years left to go still in the task. It's been her life work. And 5 of my own kids have graduated. So the question here today for us is why charter schools? What are charter schools? Why are they? Charter schools fit into a larger context about education in general, and and then education in general, and then also, well, where do public schools fit into that? And then where do charter schools fit into that world? And then charter schools haven't always existed, so why do they exist? What was moving? What were some of the cultural forces at work that brought on the need or the desire to create this thing that we are all here in this little meeting a part of? And that is the charter schools that we're involved with. So that's what we want to be looking at today. And so this will be a very, very short history of public schools. And I want to say right away that really the activity and the movement and the motivation behind the whole question that created the idea for charter schooling was really about the need for choice. Public schools existed and have existed for a very long time. And when charter schools were just a theory, just a policy idea, it was really around the idea of trying to provide choices in communities for families and for students that would have options for their children. And so really it comes down to that question there at the bottom of the slide that I will sort of threads, for me, it's a way for me to thread my way through this question, is really asking, whose child is it anyway? do the children in our schools belong to the school? Do they belong to the state? Does the state have the primary responsibility, the primary interest in the child? Or do those children belong to families and to parents? And do families and parents have the primary interest and the primary responsibility for those children, including their education? Seems like perhaps a simple question, but that issue, for me, and from my perspective, is a massive driving issue in any discussion we have about public education, including charters. So, and by the way, if anybody has questions, Sandra, Mrs. Hammond is moderating, so you can put questions in the chat box, or I'm happy to try to respond to questions as they come up. We will try to leave time for questions at the end here. So the idea of public schooling in the United States really began taking hold in the early 1800s. There were places in Massachusetts that had local community public schools, but really it was in the early 1800s that the idea of public schooling began to take hold. And what does that mean? A public school is, saying it's public is sort of euphemistic, really. What we're really talking about, schools that are operated by a local governing authority, and they're funded by taxpayer dollars. They are really government schools. That doesn't sound very nice. It sounds doesn't sound good to our ears, and so we're common, used to hearing public schooling, and that's fine with me. But really, we're talking about schools that were operated by local governments and funded through taxation. Along with public schooling, we're going to spend a couple slides on this. I think it's really, really important to understand that it's not just the idea that schools, that the community has an interest in making sure students have access to good education. And so the community takes an interest and says, yep, we're going to support that with taxpayer funds. We're behind that. There's this second part of public education that doesn't necessarily have to be a part of public education, but it is and always has been. And that is the compulsory piece, compulsory education. And when we say compulsory education, that means that children must attend school and parents may be forced by law to make children attend. That's compulsory education. And it is conceivable and possible that you could have publicly funded education and not have the compulsory element. And but we do have that. That began really with Horace Mann was a huge advocate for compulsory attendance. That started in the mid 1800s, a little after the idea of government funded schooling began to take hold. The compulsory idea began to latch on, and argued that parents must be forced to send their children to public schools. And Massachusetts was the first state to adopt compulsory school law in 1852. And I think, for whatever it's worth, Mississippi was the last, and that was somewhere in the early 20th century. And so why? What would have been the argument for saying that the government, the state, has a controlling interest to the degree that it can use the force of law to force children to attend schools, to make parents have to send their kids to school? Why? Well, it was really a part of that massive migration from agricultural, sort of rural settings in America, frontier settings, into more and more urban settings, and the growth of industry and the Industrial Revolution and all of that we've all heard about and learned about undoubtedly. The new America needed adults to be working, and there was a desire to produce a widespread basic level of education in the American populace. We needed literate, educated workforce. And there was also an interest to keep children out of factory work and off the streets. So there was a custodial care interest. And these were the arguments that were made to argue for the idea of forcing parents to send their children to school. Because again, this smacks up sort of against what's intuitively obvious, is that, well, parents love their children. Of course, they want good things for their children. Why would we have to force them to have their children do what would be good for them and to be able to prosper. Well, these were some of the arguments that were used at that time. Now, every state in the union has compulsory laws. The government, so what we have is a situation that the government pays for the child's education, that's the public part, and the government requires by force of law the child's participation in public school. And so we come back to that early question that I had on that first slide. If that's the case, if the government's paying for a child's education and is using the force of law to require participation in public schooling, whose child is it anyway? Who really has the responsibility and the rights to make decisions about what's best for children? So when you think about whatever your thoughts are on the current status of wherever we are in public education policy, when you think about some of the concerns and wonder why is it that parents seem to be left sort of on the sidelines, this slide tells you why. The government pays and the government uses by force. The parents in law and in statute just don't figure in very critically to the whole process of educating a child. So some of the consequences are obvious, right? It removes parental freedom to make decisions about how to school their children. The government has the schools, they're taxing and paying for it, they're choosing the curriculum, they're putting the school program together, they're the public schools, and school children are required to attend there. So it really does clearly remove, in law, parental freedom to make decisions for their children. And here's sort of the maybe not at first obvious real downside. And I've seen it as a practitioner for a very, very long time. And that is this idea that now the responsibility has effectively been removed from parents to educate their children. We see that very broadly in schooling across the nation in a lot of places where parents don't take responsibility for that it's the school's responsibility to raise the child, to educate the child. And it transfers, that responsibility has been transferred onto the state, and it leads to a very bad mentality in regards to who really is supposed to be doing this. And so that's an issue when schools face in whatever places where they can't seem to get parents to pay attention or to take care of their children, or wonder why don't parents do more? Well, because they've been factored out by law for very, very long time, years and years, over 100 years. Parents have been sort of sidelined because of the law, due primarily to this compulsory piece here. So that's the backdrop of public education. And so now what I want to do, because this is really supposed to be about charter schools, I wanted to paint a little bit of the backdrop. And I've said some things that may lead to questions or may be sort of provocative. And so please, I'm happy to take any questions or any concerns with anything I've said so far. But let's fast forward into the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, because that puts us into the context where in the educational policy debates, this is where the birth and the idea of charter schooling really began to take place. So by the 70s, and this is when I'm 58, and so I started in school in 1970, I think. So this is my life here before me. Cracks in the American government schooling system really begin to show. Urban areas are struggling in a whole host of demographic ways, poverty issues, and then public schools were kind of right in the center of this. All of the civil rights issues that we know from this period of time, beginning in the 60s, the public schools were, the staging areas. This is where all the cross section was happening. And so public schools really struggled to deliver on the promise that they were going to be educating kids to a high degree. And so we saw, really begin to see in the 70s and then on into the 80s, where academic results were really beginning to fail in a lot of areas. Kids weren't learning to read. Reports are coming out that, our students in America are behind all these other advanced nations, and we weren't producing the students that we were going to need in the American workforce in the future. And so there was all kinds of these sorts of studies and concern being debated and discussed during this period of time. And of course, that being the case, parents and students in that context are becoming increasingly frustrated. Parents are sending their students off on this agreement that, okay, the government's going to take the full responsibility for this and force us to be involved with this. We better see some decent results. This better be producing young people that will grow into capable, successful, contributing adults. That's the bargain. And with that being challenged and maybe not necessarily working as well as what we would hope, parents and students becoming frustrated with the public schooling system, and lots of policy ideas are beginning to be debated at this time. And the truth is, I'm going to grab something here just to make a point. The truth is that public schools everywhere became increasingly overburdened with state education code laws, and where it's to do school, the school needs to do and the district needs to do all of this. So I'm not sure, I think you should be able to see this, but this is California's education code from 2015, and it's thicker now because it's 7 years later, but this thing's a good 2.5 inches thick. And it's, the pages are real thin and the writing is real small, and there's just lots of them, and over 2,500 pages in education code law. In order to do education legally and by the book, you got to deal with the education code. So education is, public education was struggling to produce on the promise, and it was very much burdened by all of the laws and regulations and statutes that it had to navigate through. And by the way, that hasn't improved to this very day. It's still the case. So lots of reform ideas being debated at this time, but here really, and there's a bunch, but for our purposes today and for shorthanding this, here's 3 of the stickier ideas that were beginning to be talked about. One was vouchers, where the government pays back to parents with students that are school age a certain amount and gives them the money to then use that for the school of their choice, public or private. They could use it, the school of their choice, the idea of vouchers. And that's back out there being talked about in California again. Homeschooling really was at this time, 70s and 80s, on into the 90s, really began to grow and gain speed and notoriety, and lots of legal fights state by state in regards to the parental rights to be able to school their own children in their home. Those were hard fought battles that had to be won state by state. And then charter schooling was also one of those things that began to be raised as a policy idea. So what is a chartered school? For California, we were the 2nd state in the nation to approve a charter school law. For us, it was Senate Bill 1448, sponsored by a guy who's sort of legendary within the California charter school world, Senator Gary Hart. That bill was enacted into law in 1992. So what's a charter school? Well, the key phrase in the charter school law for California is this here on the slide. A charter school shall comply with this part and all of the provisions set forth in its charter, but is otherwise exempt from the laws governing school districts, except for the following. Excuse me as I keep leaving the camera. In other words, this phrase is sometimes within charter speak called the mega waiver. And what did it waive? For the most part, especially at the beginning, back in 1992, it waived all of this. Didn't have to run a school, we didn't have to navigate through all of the intricacies of the California Education Code. That has changed over time. There has been a withering effect statutorily. Charters have been pushed and pushed and pushed from the level at Sacramento to continue to push us more and more back into education code stuff. But that was the bargain, that charter schools could get out of doing the education code and follow what their charter said that they would do. And so then charter schools are necessarily born out of and driven by an educational philosophy. Charter schools, before they're founded, as they're creating their charter document, are refining and articulating what is their educational philosophy and create their own educational program. And the founders of a charter school write a charter, which is 19 questions that are spelled out in statute that we have to be able to answer about how we will educate students. And as you see there on the slide, Endeavor's charter is approximately 300 pages long in order to answer those questions. Mountain Home's charter, one of our other schools in our network, was founded in 1994. It was the 63rd charter in the state, and its original charter was 25 pages. So a lot has changed over time. So the founders write a charter answering 19 questions about who their students are going to be and what their educational model is going to be and what's their curricular approach and all of these various types of questions. Then they have to take that charter to a local district, a local school district, and that local district must approve the charter. And they don't have to approve the charter. They can turn it down. Charters get turned down all the time. And in fact, Endeavor's was turned down. We originally brought the Endeavor charter to a smaller district in the south part of Madera County called Golden Valley. And Golden Valley turned it down. And so later on, we just did the more straightforward thing, and we were operating within Fresno Unified boundaries. And so we took it to Fresno Unified, and happily they approved our charter. And so then, now that we have a charter, we have to abide by what's in that document. We have to do with that document what we said we would do in that document. And additionally, we have to prove that students are learning. That's the bargain. You get out of all of that education code stuff to create your own program, but you better be able to do the work and demonstrate that students are actually learning. That's how a charter school continues to operate. Charter schools, another one of the neat things about charter schools is that they can have their own governing board. Charter schools can govern themselves rather than be under the direct authority of the elected school district board. And why would we want that? Well, very simply because who is going, just a hypothetical, who is going to care more about what happens within that school and the kind of education that school is doing? Those who are close to it, or the governing board who just approved the charter, who has 30 or 40 other schools and lots of other concerns? Who's going to have a greater vested interest into the durability and the success of that local charter school? Well, it's pretty clear that local governance is going to have a greater interest in that. So charter schools can do that. The way we do that in California is you have to form a nonprofit 501c3 corporation. And that's who Western Sierra Charter Schools is. That's the nonprofit corporation. And so the board of Western Sierra Charter Schools is the governing board of Western Sierra Charters, and therefore Endeavor Charter School, Glacier High School, and Mountain Home School. Charter schools also, so the governance comes to the school. And also the funding comes to the school. We are able to be funded directly instead of having the funding go to the local district, and then the local district board determine how that money flows out to its various schools. That's how districts handle school funding in any given school. The student in the school at whatever district public school generates certain amount of funding, but then the district decides where does that funding need to go in the district priorities. For a charter school, the funding for every student comes back to us at the school level. And then the advantage of that, of course, is we have control. We've taken fiscal control, we've taken governance control. This is all very good in answering that question that I posed, whose child is it anyway? But again, we live or die on the district approving our charter on an ongoing basis. We have to go back to the school district every 1 to 5 years, depending on what kind of authorization we get from the district to again go and prove that we are worthy and that students are learning in our schools demonstrably. And there's an increasing variety of other things that we have to go and prove. But for our purposes here, that's generally the idea. Endeavor was approved originally kind of pretty uniquely for a full 5-year term. There were other schools on the docket at Fresno Unified that night when we were approved that got approved for 2 years. Well, we got approved for 5 years, but we have to go back and be able to do it all over again and prove that we should exist to stay alive. So there might be times, folks, where we have to reach out to families and say, hey, support us. When you choose to come to a charter school, in this case, Endeavor, you really are coming to something that's unique and special in that it doesn't just automatically get to go on. Charter schools were created by legislative fiat, so to speak. They can be also removed by legislative action as well. And so there'll be times when we may reach out and say, hey, parents, we need your support at Sacramento level, or we need your support at the local district level. So if you're with us long enough, you will probably hear that call to action at some point. In the original charter school law, it allowed 100 charter schools in the state. And as we proudly like to point out, Mountain Homeschool, one of our charters in our network, was the 63rd charter in the state. And so one of the oldest operating charter schools. And half of those original 63 of the ones that were for Mountain Home have closed since then. So there's probably only about 30 schools left of the original up to the 63. So we're one of the founding programs. Pretty neat. Now there are more than 1,323. This data I was pulling this from is probably a couple years old. So it's, I'm sure, a little bit more than this, but there's now more than 1,300 charter schools currently operating in California. And they have, let me go back to this. And let me say, you're an Endeavor Charter School, which is a personalized learning school. And we'll talk briefly about that before we close here. But there's charter schools that do all kinds of focuses. Again, the founders had to create an educational philosophy and then implement that philosophy. And there's all sorts of various focuses that charter schools have that are responsive to their communities. They may be in a very common, you're in an area that's super underserved in a high dense urban area with lots of high poverty rate. And so there's schools that go in and they're not personalized learning schools, but they are going in and getting it done and just really working on the basics and not accepting failure. And so there's some neat things that are being done, different educational philosophies, but within the charter world. So California is the biggest charter schooling state in the nation. There's over 660,000 students in the state enrolled in charter schools. 2018-19, there were at least 70 new schools that were started and about 30,000 new students that year as well. So briefly, Western Sierra Charter Schools. Who are we? This is Western Sierra Charter Schools is the nonprofit corporation that governs. So there's the timeline of establishment. Endeavor established 2019. Endeavor is the 2099th school that was established in California. You can see Glacier was 479 and Mountain Home was 63. And you can see, since there's like 1,300 schools still operating, many schools have closed over time. And so here, what's the educational philosophy for WSCS? I hope everybody that's here involved with this little meeting has a pretty decent idea, but let me say, here it is. Western Sierra Charter Schools, those 4 points that are broken out, this is our vision statement. Rigorous, dynamic, accountable learning community that's built upon these 4 things. These are heart and soul for me very personally, as well as for our whole staff and what we're about. And that is, we're a school of voluntary association. No student is compelled by compulsory education to come to Endeavor. Students are there because their parents and they have made the choice voluntarily to associate with what we do. And they stay there by voluntary choice, right? Nobody has to be there. And I'm sure I'm not alone, but that is one to live and die on. Voluntary association that concept is massive within our organization and within just civil society. This is a very, very important piece. Obviously, as you know, we're committed to parent leadership in the process. And how do we best do that? We're a school. We have to meet state requirements, and they demand a lot from us, but our driving heartbeat is to help parents implement this job of educating their children. We do this through what we call personalized learning. You may call it homeschooling. I would like you to begin to use the term personalized learning because you are working with us. We're a school, it's a partnership. We're here to serve you and your family, but we provide all kinds, the good stuff. We provide classes and guidance and lots of curriculum and choices and all kinds of various things. And so we do that in a partnership together. We call it personalized learning. And then, hey, we're a school. We're not Disneyland. So it sounds like too good to be true, but we're not Disneyland. So we really are. We're a school. So we're going to talk about and look for and implement and do all we can to expect and achieve high academic standards for all students. So closing thought in regards to whose child is it anyway? This is very fresh from April 24th. This is just 2 weeks ago from the New York Times, an article titled, "It's Life or Death. U.S. Teenagers Face a Mental Health Crisis." The mental health issues of students, I keep seeing it, it's just massive. It's like juggernaut. There's so much stuff going on in regards to student mental health. Well, this was an article from the New York Times. Same newspaper, New York Times, that same day, another article says, "The city has a loneliness problem." And then on April 12th, the Wall Street Journal had an article, says this, headline article, "Children as young as 8 should be screened for anxiety, experts recommend." What's the answer to these very real, concerning issues? Student mental health is just one of the issues, right? I mean, there's so many things we could say in regards to raising and educating children and what's best for children to prosper and to thrive. What's best? Well, is the answer a longer school year? These are all ideas that are being debated out there and policy-wise and being implemented in some places. Is it a longer school year? Is that what we need? Do we need longer school days? Do we need compulsory preschool or compulsory transitional kindergarten? Do we need school safety officers? Do we need more school counselors? Do we need more government intervention into the lives of our students? More government programs? Or perhaps is the answer to this very profound and real challenge that our young people face, perhaps found in robust family life, hands-on parenting and passing on life values and priorities through relationships, parent to child? Is it perhaps found, and we could go on with these, but is it perhaps found in limiting how much our young people are submersed in teen youth culture? What's the answer? I can tell you that as an organization, as an institution, for us at Western Sierra Charter Schools, we find the answer back to what we're committed to. We want to see what Paul Simon in his song from so long ago called the mother-child reunion. We want to see robust families and parents involved, and parents having the dawning realization that they have lots of power in the life of their children for good for them, and that they have a lot more authority and power than they might have known, because it's been, again, taken away for so long legislatively. And so we really want to help parents be able to see that job through. And we're going to side on that the answer probably for what's best for children is still going to be found with mom and dad. So there is, folks, my presentation to what charter schools are, where they come from, and a little bit of what they're about and who Western Sierra Charter Schools is. And I've talked over my time, but I do want to be able to take questions, and I will defer to Mrs. Hammond because maybe she's going to give me a hard stop here. I don't know. So Sandra, there it is. And I can go off of slides and stop sharing.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah.
We had just one mention on the chat that your efforts were a valiant, what did he say exactly? A valiant effort. And yes, that was a tough year trying to get that charter. And I think we all so appreciate that. Does anybody have any questions? I was wondering, you briefly touched on some efforts that are out there, some pursuits on dealing with the mental health crisis. But what about any current legislative issues right now? When we were at the conference recently, there was the seat-based, non-seat-based. Maybe you could touch on that.
So, if we look over the last few years, it has, prior to pandemic time, charters were really kind of besieged by a variety of initiatives that were coming out of Sacramento to limit charter schools' effect and try to stop charter schools from being able to grow and really hinder charter schools in what they do, and to push charter schools more and more back into this book, that push us back into following ed code. And so those things will come again. Those times, I think, will come again. But really, the truth is, I can say happily, for the moment, there's not a lot legislatively out there that's being aimed at us. I think it's sort of recovering, getting back to business from pandemic might be one of the reasons. And also the state, miraculously, I don't know how this works, but California and in its government coffers is flood tide with money. So those that are usually fighting over the money and where the money goes and who gets it, that's usually what's motivating, like Xing charter schools out. There's usually money question behind it. Those questions aren't really out there right now because there's so much money available. So there's really not a whole lot to share there at this time, happily.
Mike, here's a question in the chat. Mr. DeSutter says, what's the next step? Stay on course with the Dawn of Endeavor or something else?
So for us at Endeavor, we can, in Western Sierra Charter Schools in general, we feel like we have our niche. There's, how we implement personalized learning and how we serve parents and students has changed over time, and we like to think that we've improved and grown. Some of it has come because there's been legislative force, new laws that make us have to do stuff and pass on to you. For instance, that silly email that you have to get automated every day at the end of the day, the most ridiculous thing that says tiered re-engagement. We're doing this. It's our best understanding of how we stay within the law and implement what the law does. And so we send out this silly email. So, but in regards to our services, we're committed to the services, and we'll never change from the idea of parent-led education. And we'll never change from the idea of personalized education and really making education meaningful down to the individual students. We're committed to that. How we do it as technology changes, as we hopefully get better, and who our clientele is, who's the community we're serving, it will change and morph. But I think we're sticking with that model. For Endeavor, we need more space. We have waiting lists, and we're in a tight little building, and we don't have any money. Like, Endeavor's a new school, and it's like the kid who just moved out of his parents' house. Like, lots of gumption, lots of energy, and very little money. And so it's going to take some years of enrollments to be able to build up reserve that we then want to be able to go to perhaps lender or other financiers to say, hey, we have something here that we want to be able to go build or renovate another facility that suits us better. But that's going to be probably a multi-year horizon as we build financial reserves. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what comes to my mind. I see a question in regards to a parent club. Would we welcome that? Be ready for time? Absolutely. And Gabby, thank you for that question, and would love to talk to you, because the way we communicate, like, so you all are probably very familiar with the parent squares that we send out. Well, those parent squares, we pay for that service through our general fund dollars, which is part of our regular school business. That's government funding, and we have to be totally nonpartisan and take no political positions when we're using things like Parent Square, any of our official communication. But there's times when there may be bills that are hostile to charters or anti-charter, just to say it flat out, in Sacramento that we really would like to make parents aware of. We have to be very careful how we communicate that. But if we had parent clubs who had, well-developed networks within schools and maybe outside of our school who could communicate, parent clubs can communicate however they want. And so that would be very helpful in the future if somebody wants to help us, get something like a parent club started for that purpose. Do we have any other questions? Do you have any questions, Mrs. Hammond? I think this was your brainchild. I think you were the one who thought of the idea and wanted this addressed.
Yes, and I thank you so much for this. I guess that we're finished. Only 10 minutes over. That's amazing. We usually go a lot over, quite honestly.
Okay. Good.
Great. Thank you all for attending, Mike. We'll get this up so that if you have friends and family, anybody that would like to see this, the recordings will be available. It'll take us about a week, though, to get this done. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody, for joining in. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.